Leon Panetta 2016 Lecture Series, An America in Renaissance or Decline, The Challenges Facing a New President. This lecture discusses changing society, technology, and media. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Secretary Leon Panetta.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and good evening to everyone. Normally, Sylvia would be doing this responsibility, but she is in Minneapolis, Minnesota, with our son Carmelo and his family, being a grandmother. In Italian, we would say a nonna, but she's being a grandmother to our grandchildren, while their parents, who are both cardiologists, take a very needed break. It's my pleasure, however, to join with her in welcoming you to the Sunset Cultural Center in beautiful Carmel by the Sea for the final event of the Panetta 2016 Lecture Series. This is our final forum for this year's series. This year, as you all know, we've been discussing what the future holds for our nation and asking the question, will we be an America in Renaissance or an America in decline? The challenges facing the next president. Tonight, we'll turn our focus to technology and media and the impact that they have on our changing society. In the course of a generation, the world has moved from one in which most people had more limited access to any information. We now live in a world in which everyone has access to every piece of information in the public domain. This change is having a dramatic impact on the role of the media, the development of public opinion, and the way individuals are engaging with one another and with their government. The world is sharing information faster than ever before, but we are actually communicating with people in this forum, this high-tech forum. But the real question is, are we really communicating with one another? Are we really having a conversation? Some observers say that we now hold democracy in the palm of our hands. However, the key question is whether this portable, soundbite-filled, 140-character-based democracy is good for our nation. Does it help unify us, or does it further divide us? How will the next president communicate with all of the American people? Can we maintain journalistic standards of multiple sources and objectivity in an age when news is presented through algorithms and personalized filters designed to promote commerce and too often promote one point of view? With all of the changes in our society, in technology and in media, can we return civility to our democracy and to our society? These are the questions that will be presented to three of the nation's most respected journalists, each of whom has dedicated themselves to special consideration of the role of media, the impact of technology, and the next generation of voters. Our first guest has spent more than a century, half a century, He'd have a hard time being here otherwise. Half a century in the broadcast journalism arena, and is recognized around the world as one of the most trusted voices in current events and issues of global importance. He first reported on Richard Nixon's presidential campaign. He was ABC's diplomatic correspondent while Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State, and he covered the Vietnam War. When the Iran hostage crisis erupted in 1979, he became the anchor of what was called then the Iran crisis, Americans held hostage. The show was later renamed Nightline in 1980, and he spent more than 25 years as anchor and managing editor of that landmark news program. Through his work on Nightline, time when I first came to know him, he won every major professional recognition in the field of broadcast journalism and became the longest-serving news anchor in United States broadcast history. He now serves as a news analyst for NPR, a special correspondent on the NBC News magazine Rock Center, and a contributing columnist for several leading newspapers in the country. In 2015, he published the bestseller, Lights Out, which examines the threat of a potential cyber catastrophe and how Americans can prepare for that. It's a book that I highly recommend to all of you. A distinguished journalist, a good friend, please welcome Ted Koppel. One of America's accomplished news anchors, our second guest, has covered 8 presidential elections. She joined NBC News in 1977, serving as the network's White House correspondent, and went on to serve as chief Washington correspondent on the NBC program, The Today Show. She chronicled her experience in her 1982 book, This is Judy Woodruff at the White House. She spent the next 10 years at PBS, where she was anchor of Frontline with Judy Woodruff and chief Washington correspondent for the MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour. In 1993, Judy joined CNN and served for 12 years as anchor and senior correspondent for Inside Politics. That was, by the way, the nation's first program devoted exclusively to politics. Today, she is back as PBS as co-anchor and managing editor for the NewsHour. While there, she completed a series of documentaries on the views of young Americans called Generation Next, Speak Up, Be Heard. From 2006 to 2013, Judy also anchored a monthly program for Bloomberg Television entitled Conversations with Judy Woodruff. A former lecture series speaker, she's been honored by the Panetta Institute with our Jefferson Lincoln Award. Please welcome one of the best in the business, Judy Woodruff.
Leon, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And our final guest has been covering the news business since 1990. He's a veteran journalist who specializes in questioning the media's objectivity and fairness on subjects ranging from politics to technology to business and culture and sports. In 1981, he was hired by Bob Woodward and joined the Washington Post. He spent 29 years at the Washington Post and went on to serve as Justice Department and congressional reporter, New York bureau chief, and deputy national editor. In 1990, he became the media reporter for the paper and wrote the widely read weekly column, Media Notes. Moving into television, he spent 15 years as the host of CNN's Reliable Sources before joining Fox News Channel in 2013. Currently, he serves as host of Fox News' Media Buzz, where he examines the bias and shortcomings of the news business. The show has been the #1 rated program in its time slot for 2 years. He's also the author of 5 books, including Media Circus, Reality Show, and the New York Times bestseller, Spin Cycle. Please welcome one of the most knowledgeable experts on the changes in media and technology, Howard Kurtz. And now I'll put on my old hat of moderator. And again, welcome you all to this final forum of the Panetta Lecture Series. Our theme has been an America in Renaissance or decline, challenges facing a new president. And we've discussed in that process issues related to terrorism, foreign affairs, our economy, political gridlock. But tonight we turn to an issue that is very unique to the 21st century, which is the issue of the changes in technology, in media, that are confronting our country and a new president in the future. We've gone through a number of stages. As a boy, young boy, I can remember sitting around the radio with my parents listening to fireside chats by President Roosevelt on the radio. We then moved into the television era and experienced Oval Office addresses delivered from the White House on television. And I can remember Presidents Eisenhower and Johnson and Nixon, all the way to President Reagan and President Clinton providing those addresses from the Oval Office. Today we've moved into a whole new stage where we have Twitter and Facebook and Snapshot or whatever the hell it's called. And we're dealing with YouTube, and we're dealing with all kinds of new elements in social media that in many ways have appealed to a lot of different segments within our society. And the question facing a new president is, how does a new president speak to all of the American people? And how does a president use some of this new social media in order to be able to unify this country rather than divide us? Now, those are some of the questions that we'll be talking to these wonderful speakers that we have this evening about. Let me begin by asking you a question that I've actually asked each one of our panels at the beginning, which is that the new president goes into the Oval Office and calls you up and asks you to come to the Oval Office. And this is by no means a given, considering some of the candidates. But let's assume that they're willing to ask you in. And say to you, look, I really do want to speak to the American people. You know, I remember presidents that were able to speak to the American people, unify the country. But now I'm dealing with Twitter, I'm dealing with all of the social media. How do I effectively address the American people as President of the United States in this era of social media?
Well, one of the candidates isn't going to be asking that question. One of the candidates already knows the answer to that question. One of the candidates has 6 million followers on Twitter and close to 8 million followers on Facebook. And he has done a brilliant dance around the establishment media over the past year. And he is now the Republican candidate for president because he knows exactly how to use the tools that have been put at his disposal. Whether Secretary Clinton will be as effective at using those tools, I don't know. But I think, in a sense, Leon, you may be asking the wrong question. It can't be changed anymore. The fact of the matter is that we once lived in a society, you and I, when the most trusted man in America was a television news anchor, a fellow by the name of Walter Cronkite. That seems almost quaint today. There is no such person anymore. There is no single man or woman in this country, in the media, in politics, in any position of authority. This is a political campaign that has been run successfully by at least two of the candidates, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, on the predicate that you can't trust the establishment, on the predicate that we're not going to bring the American public together. What he has done, I'm speaking now, well, actually both of them have very successfully winnowed out a segment of the electorate and done it using social media. So the idea that we're ever going to go back to the days when we sat in front of that flickering altar at 6:30 at night and were brought together by the anchors on ABC, NBC, and CBS, them days is over.
Judy?
Well, I would certainly agree with Ted that what we've seen this year is some of the candidates using what we call social media to a brilliant degree. When you see what Donald Trump has been able to accomplish, I would argue with the cooperation of the establishment news media. They have given him enormous amounts of free airtime, which is worth, by some calculation, something like $2 billion worth of free airtime, because he was able to call in often, and as well as appear in person. I would tackle your question coming at it from a somewhat different approach and building on what Ted said. I think the difficulty today is that so many Americans aren't ready to listen to a president, to a politician or a president, if that figure, that person, is not already in their political lane. If they don't already square their views, then they really don't want to hear what that person has to say. It's not true of everybody, but we now know from looking at what the pollsters tell us after exhaustive research, about 40% of the American people are consistently on the right, 40% are consistently on the left, give or take. And then there's a chunk in the middle who, yes, will listen, and you want to try to reach them every which way you can. Talk to the print media, talk to television, do social media, go around and make speeches, anything you can do. Get talk radio to interview you. But there are too many people who I think are now so entrenched in their views, they're not listening. And I think I think that may be as big of an issue for us as what's happened to the media.
Howard?
Mr. President, congratulations. You are now the leader of the free world. You can make news at a moment's notice. You can give an Oval Office speech, and the networks will carry that. However, if you try to do that a second time, the broadcast networks may say no, because they would rather have their lucrative primetime programming. Mr. President, you actually now have to compete with many conversations and many messages. You have to utilize alternative means of getting your message out. Now, Barack Obama, Mr. President, made some progress in that regard. He was somewhat mocked for appearing with Zach Galifianakis on a podcast called Between Two Ferns, but it turned out to be the most widely viewed part of his effort to win support for Obamacare. At the same time, he probably could have passed up on an interview with YouTube star Glozell Green, most famous for taking a bath in Fruit Loops. I don't suggest you go that way, Mr. President. Now, if it were to be President Trump, I would say, Mr. President, I think you need to step away from the Twitter a little bit, because you now have a very big megaphone, and you can't be picking fights with everybody who ticks you off and every third-rate cable news guest who you want to settle a score with. It's very effective. You used it to get elected, but you've got to be more selective, because everything a president does is news. The bottom line, Mr. President, is every single day you have to fight to get your message out and to have it be heard in an equally loud fashion to all of your detractors who also have these tools at their disposal.
You mentioned President Obama, who in many ways is really the first president in this kind of social media era. There is now, interestingly enough, as an old White House hand, there is a White House Office of Digital Strategy that's been established, and it's basically, you know, its own production company.
Is that showing people how to give the finger?
Perhaps that's one digital feature. It's a 14-member staff.
He didn't say this when he was on the air.
It uses BuzzFeed, again, whatever that is, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, live streaming capabilities. The president obviously continues to have press conferences, but he's obviously delivered very few addresses from the Oval Office in terms of speeches to the American people. So he's been fairly effective at using social media. But I guess my question is, in his use of it, has he unified the country or further divided it? Because in many ways, when you're using social media, you're communicating with parts of the electorate that already identify with you. And I guess that would be my question. In using social media, do you unify the country, or do you appeal to those that already support you?
You're stepping into an environment that already is polarized. I see this on Facebook every day, because Facebook used to be, just a couple of years ago, a friendlier environment than Twitter, which can get pretty ugly. It also has a great side, because it lets a lot of voices be heard. And so now people used to post pictures of their dogs and communicate with their friends, are unfriending each other because the Bernie supporters and the Hillary supporters don't get along, and the pro-Trump and the anti-Trump people. So I think the age of broadcasting, it's not to say the broadcast networks have no relevance, but the age of broadcasting is over. We're in the age of narrowcasting, and I think that any president to communicate effectively has to reach different kinds of groups, and that may mean going on late night shows. It may mean doing talk radio. It may mean using Snapchat, which is the actual name of it, and President Obama did an interview with BuzzFeed, which is an incredibly popular site, and he did a lot of shtick, and that was popular too. So I don't think to say whether it unifies the country or further polarizes the country, that's the environment that's out there. Any politician, president or otherwise, has to be able to communicate in these multiple environments.
Let me ask you about the companies that are involved with social media. Policy director for Mitt Romney's campaign in 2012, who I think is now at the Hoover Institute, was quoted as saying the following, and I quote, "At the end of the day, I am skeptical that the Googles of the world are going to be as open to a Republican president as they are to a Democratic president." We're talking obviously about very large multi-billion-dollar companies in Silicon Valley. And yet we know Google has already been challenged in terms of whether or not they're being objective with regards to partisan issues. Apple has already said that it will not fund or provide support to the Republican National Convention. Can or should these companies truly be objective? Or will they always favor liberal-leaning politics? In other words, will they continue to have an undue influence in their content based on their political philosophies?
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Just briefly, we have a real live example of that with Facebook, which was accused of having some of its employees, journalists who are hired to tweak the algorithms, tilt against conservatives in the way the trending topics were identified. And Mark Zuckerberg did a smart thing, and he understood that probably most of his employees are liberal, being in the Silicon Valley community. He called in a bunch of conservatives, and he made some changes to try to combat that impression. I think it is good business for Google and Apple and Microsoft and Twitter and the others to present what appears to be an unbiased platform, because after all, it's the public that provides the content. Because if they get a reputation for favoring one side or the other, I think people who are not in that political camp may go elsewhere.
What do you think?
I think you're beginning on too contemporary a level. I think we have to unravel what's been happening over the past 30 years. I mean, among the things that have happened over the past 30 years has been a spate of deregulation. There was a day 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, actually had some clout. When they could go after a network or a radio station or a television station and say, listen, here's what the FCC regulations say. They say you are obliged to operate because it belongs to all of you, the airwaves do. So you are obliged, networks and television stations, to operate in the public interest, convenience, and necessity. What that meant was make all the money you want off 77 Sunset Strip and I Love Lucy and every other comedy and drama show that you've got, but we expect you to run a news division that actually provides public service. And if you don't do that, we may take away your license, or we may at least suspend your license. The FCC today has no teeth. And part of the outgrowth of the fragmentation of the media that has taken place. I mean, when I was a young reporter 100 years ago, we had the three networks, and that was essentially it. And over the course of the last 30 or 40 years, you've got cable, you've got satellite, you've got the internet. And the amount of competition that exists today and the number of outlets that are in competition today has squeezed the networks, for example, so that they are providing far less real news coverage. We used to believe that it was our obligation to give you news that you needed to know. I must say PBS still does that. Judy's program still does that. But the networks don't. The networks have been squeezed to the point that rather than giving you the news you need to know, they're giving you the news you want to know. Why you want to know as much about the Kardashians as you apparently do, I will never understand, but there it is. That kind of competition has led to the diminution of network news divisions long before Twitter came along, long before Facebook came along, long before Snapchat, whatever it is, long before that came along. So we're dealing with a whole new environment out there in which people really are not looking to the media anymore to give them an objective, serious coverage of the news. If they want it, they go to PBS, they go to NPR, they read the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. But the fact of the matter is, it began changing long before these new media came along.
Judy, what do you think about these companies in terms of influencing the content that they provide?
Well, the short answer is that I don't know what they're going to do down the road, because they are not news organizations. They are methods of delivering, letting people communicate with each other on Facebook or Twitter, letting people vent about whatever they want to talk about at the latest TV show that they love, or the joke they heard, or their neighbor said something. They are not news organizations. So we are in a, as Ted described the history of it, we're in a brave new world where the old media is still around. It's weakened in many regards, but it's still turning out news. And in fact, the news that these old organizations are turning out, like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, NBC, PBS, and so forth, is being channeled on these new, through these new companies like Facebook, like Twitter, Snapchat, and so on. We are in a wholly new environment. It's very hard to figure out what it's going to look like in 5 years or 10 years because it's evolving before our eyes. Ted talks about regulation. Regulation has to be very different for these companies because they're conduits, and they perform a lot of entertainment functions as well as news functions. I will say that on this pure, does Facebook tilt the news or not? As somebody who's a consumer of a couple of these social media outlets, to me it's not in their interest, as Howard said, to go left or right, because then you're losing half of the American people. So I don't see them doing that.
Let me ask you about the dangers of social media.
Can I just jump in, Leon, with one further observation? To the degree that you want to reach a large number of Americans at the same time, you're still best off doing it on the networks. So the fact of the matter is, Howard, what are the ratings now? How many? The 3 evening newscasts, about
25 million.
25 million people. There is no other place where you can reach 25 million people at the same time. Is there?
You can get many millions of views on YouTube if you've got something that goes viral.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, if you're talking to the president, you're saying, Mr. President, you want to reach the American public, you still reach the largest number at the same time by going on the traditional network.
All right, let me raise this issue of using social media to, quote, incite the mob, unquote. We've just witnessed the events that took place in Great Britain with Brexit. Emotions were running high. A lot of that was feeding into social media, creating a firestorm of anger, populism. We've seen all of the impact that had, and there's a comment that a lot of those same forces exist in the United States. Is there a danger that the next president could use social media to target that anger in ways to basically drive a political agenda? In other words, using social media can be a way to basically incite those emotions.
It's already happening.
But you got to get followers. The fact of the matter is, simply because you were president of the United States doesn't mean that if you send out a tweet that the largest, you're not going to get more people reading your tweet than the Kardashians get putting out their tweets. You've still got to convince people that you're saying something they want to hear.
Well, let me ask you this, because
I think, if I could just interrupt.
Go ahead.
I think you're already seeing that to some extent. I mean, that's what Donald Trump's stock and trade is,
right.
Being angry, for the most part, on social media, criticizing other people, expressing and venting his anger. So we are seeing that, and we're seeing that it's worked so far. The question is, will it work as more people tune in and pay attention to the election? And you asked, could a president do it? Would the country accept that? If a president decided, I'm just going to go out with a vengeance and go after some idea or against some idea, would the American people go along with that?
Well, let me raise this issue, because the dean of the University of Pennsylvania Annenberg School of Communication said this about social media, and I quote, "This is a medium largely meant to motivate the core, rather than a medium to convince those on the other side or in the neutral camp," the independents that you were talking about. If this is true, and the president is trying to convince and educate the American public with regards to something that that president wants to do, not to motivate them, not to drive them, but to educate them, then what does he use in order to be able to accomplish that?
Well, I think we ought to be careful about describing the millions and millions of Americans who are on social media as some kind of alien, angry force. A lot of them are angry. There are Twitter mobs out there. I hear from them every day. One of the things that drives me crazy is you might write an article, and of course we are all kind of self-promotional in the news business these days, so you post it and you have a headline, and then you get people who comment on it who just saw the headline, and then they completely misrepresent what you said. They haven't bothered to click on the article, they haven't gone to the video link, and then you have people arguing with them over things that you have never said, and then you have to decide, do you want to engage and try to get into this? But at the same time, there is anger, there is emotion, there is all of that. But there is a real positive, healthy, democratic part to this emerging social media. And that is, in the days when Walter Cronkite was the most trusted, in the days when we all relied on 3 networks and a handful of newspapers and news magazines, which mattered what they put on their cover, Time, Newsweek, U.S. News, 2 of which are not really around anymore. It was a one-way conversation. The phrase media elite was largely accurate. And now, anybody with a modem and something to say can gain a following, can comment, can yell back at us, which I think is a healthy thing. I think there's more of a dialogue now. Now, can it be misused? Does it get out of control? Have people in my profession and politics profession lost their jobs over one single errant, dumb tweet? Yes, all of that is true, but that is the world in which we now live.
Let's turn to the campaign that we're in now in 2016, and you've already mentioned the ability to use some of this media in that process. I mean, Republicans began this campaign with 17 candidates, and a lot of them were trying to use the more traditional approaches to the political campaign and the organizations they created and the media and policy positions. And Trump comes into it and suddenly uses Twitter, uses these call-ins, says a lot of outrageous things about whether we build a wall or deport millions of immigrants out of this country, or stop Muslims, or even criticize John McCain as not being a hero. And by the way, all of those would have destroyed any other candidate. And yet, somehow, he was able not only to survive, but to thrive on the use of that. Why was Trump successful in his ability to use that medium? And is it something that will work in November as well as in the primaries?
It was my job to follow every one of the candidates on all these social media outlets, and I have to tell you, most of them were really boring because they used Twitter to put out 140-character press releases. They sounded like political speak. One of the things, love Donald Trump or hate him, that has attracted a lot of Americans to him is that he sounds like a real guy. He doesn't have the practice, focus grouped political speak that sands off the rough edges. And that's the way he was on Twitter. And did he go too far on occasion and beat up on people and repeat certain things that turned out not to be true? Yes, he did all of that, but it sounded like a real person, like he had his fingers on the keyboard. Now, that was very successful with the more limited universe of the Republican primary electorate. He has proven to be having trouble transitioning to a more general electorate where you're dealing with people of much broader political philosophies. But the other thing to keep in mind is it's not just how many people read Donald Trump's tweets or Hillary Clinton's tweets, which are now getting a little more provocative as she tries to compete in this space. It's that news organizations look at them and say, Trump responded to this, and it gets on cable news, and it gets on other websites, and it might even get on the evening news. So these campaigns now have a way to drive news, to respond in real time, to influence the dialogue, and they do it by dialing it up to 11 at times. That will turn some people off, but it will also make news.
And Trump, I think, has been more successful at it because of what we've been talking about. He's more provocative. He's more prepared to go out there. That gets the media, we call it the shiny object. Sometimes he's the shiny object. Whatever he said is shinier, more provocative than what anybody else said, and it
Talking
gets
about
more eyeballs.
Pocahontas for Elizabeth Warren, for example.
And the media, in its just because of what the media is drawn to those most provocative comments.
Ted, is that the right formula for him to use in November?
Well, I don't know about that, but I'd just like to comment on what is sort of implicit in the conversation thus far. And that is, we keep throwing around the word democracy. There has been a democratization of communication in this country. More people, more individuals are able to get into the dialogue. And we look upon that as though, because the word democracy is somehow attached to it, that it were necessarily a good thing. I think it's a disaster. We do not live in a democracy. We live in a republic in which representational government is the way that we make laws. And the fact of the matter is, if someone asks me, do I want to live in a democracy where, and certainly the technology exists now, we can have 150 million voting adults sitting at home with some piece of equipment that allows them to vote on every piece of legislation that comes before, that would have come before the Congress in the old days, would have come before our representatives in government. Do I want us to have that kind of power? Absolutely not. Under no circumstances.
I don't want that either, but it sounds like you would prefer the days when the megaphones were largely limited to these media organizations, and that you feel like a lot of people out there aren't particularly informed and maybe their opinions shouldn't carry much weight.
Yeah, well, to a certain extent that's true, Howard. I do feel that because, as I used to say to groups of college students when I was lecturing 30 years ago, it's not that we are smarter than you are. We're not. When I say we, I mean journalists. It's just that you're engaged in being lawyers and doctors and carpenters and plumbers. You have work that occupies 10, 12, 18 hours of your day every day. And what we as journalists used to do in this country was spend our 10, 12, 16 hours a day covering the news and trying to do it in as objective a fashion as we could. I'm not suggesting that hearing people's opinions is not important. I'm just suggesting that having 100 million journalists out there, every one of whom, look, the late great senator from New York, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, used to say, every man or woman is entitled to his or her own opinion. They're not entitled to their own facts. These days, everybody acts as though he is entitled to his own facts. There are still 27% of the American public who believe that President Obama was not born in the United States. Where the hell did that come from? Right? And that, in large measure, is a fruit of a lot of people out there, communicating directly with one another rather than doing it through someone like Judy or you or me or someone who is paid to do it for a living and whose reputation used to depend upon the notion that we were doing it without bias, that we were doing it as objectively as it was possible to do it. We're the ones who've given up. And I'm suggesting, I think it's time to get journalism back into the act. And to get...
To some extent, what you're talking about just occurred in Britain. I mean, the reality is that the vote in Britain is something that the Parliament would never have done.
Yeah. And I think the realization that is gradually dawning upon the English public is that they may have made a mistake. They may have been, the electricity, the enthusiasm that can be generated on these, by this. I talk about what Trump has done, in using Twitter as providing the illusion of intimacy. It's as though he is talking directly to me. Isn't that wonderful? Donald took time out of his really busy day to communicate directly with me. Horseshit.
I don't remember that on
Sing a whole new Ted Koppel.
Howard and Judy, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this. I mean, there is an argument that in many ways Trump was the creature of the press by virtue of the fact that he was good for ratings, he was good for clicks. No one really challenged his positions. I think in the process, interestingly, New York Times said he received about $1.9 billion in media attention compared to others who got much less than that. Did the press help create Trump?
No, I'm going to push back on this because I know that's a myth that has taken place. We created Trump without the media, being bowing to the gods of the ratings. Trump would never have gotten anywhere. Trump, whether you like him or don't like him, learned the craft in New York dealing with the tabloids every day, and he is a media master. He knows how to make charges and push things beyond the envelope so that the dialogue revolves around him. Now, did the media, in their fascination with this new phenomenon and wanting people to watch and wanting to generate clicks online, over-cover Trump to some degree? That is true, especially the early months, the rallies that were carried, he would say the same things and he would get all his free airtime. But a lot of this was Trump doing interviews. And yes, he should not have been able to call into the Sunday shows. He should have had to show up on camera. But in those interviews, some of them, certainly not all of them, he was subjected to real journalistic questioning. I am very much in favor of that. I was able to interview him in this campaign 5 times, and I did not give him an easy time. I was fair to him, but I pressed him on all kinds of things. I also tried to get Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz and Jeb Bush, and they often said no. And it's not just my experience. Many of my fellow anchors say the same thing. So you had one candidate who was endlessly available, even when he was in trouble, even when the coverage would be negative. I think that also helped him because he was also running against the media, an institution that many people do not trust. And then you had other candidates who just didn't feel as comfortable or doing it as often as the guy who was dominating the conversation. So were the media, was Trump able to manipulate the media to some degree? Sure, like every politician tries to do. Did we just turn over the airwaves to him? I would disagree with that.
I have a different view. I think when you get almost $2 billion worth of free media coverage, it makes a difference. Donald Trump started out not being taken very seriously as a candidate.
Which was a mistake, in retrospect.
True, in retrospect. But at the time, he was not taken seriously. He was a reality TV star who had strong opinions. He had talked about running for president before, but few people took him seriously. But because he started saying things that caught the attention of the media, he started getting enormous amounts of coverage. And the Shorenstein Center at Harvard, the Public Media, Public Policy Center, went back and looked at the coverage he got in 2015 versus the coverage that Hillary Clinton and other candidates got. His coverage, her coverage, was by far the most negative of the coverage that he got, and I think most of the other Republican can't, because they didn't get very much coverage. And you could argue, well, that was 2015. He stood on his own 2 feet in 2016. Yes, but what happened in 2015 laid the groundwork for 2016. The expectation rose. He came into the primaries in 2016 and caucuses already at a high level. And I think his rise was clearly fueled by the media. Did he know how to take advantage of it? Absolutely. He was very clever about the way he has presented himself, the arguments he's made, but I think the media is completely played an enormous role in his rise.
There was a great Baltimore journalist by the name of H.L. Mencken, who about 75 years ago made the observation that is equally true today, that nobody ever went broke underestimating the good taste of the American public.
All right, that brings us to the halfway point. Let me take a moment, if I can, to recognize our question review team, people who are responsible for selecting the questions that I'll present to our speakers. And again, if you'll hold your applause until I introduce the entire group. Our question review team consisted of Chelsea Adami, who is a public safety reporter for the Salinas Californian, Julie Copeland, who's a city editor for the Santa Cruz Sentinel, Fran Gaber, who's a veteran question review team member, Doug McKnight, who's a reporter for KAZU Radio, and Don Miller, who's the executive editor of the Monterey Herald and the Santa Cruz Sentinel. If you would thank them, I would appreciate that. And Sylvia and I, along with all of the Panetta Institute Board of Directors, are very grateful for the generous support of our sponsors and for all of your support as well. We didn't have a student program for this event, obviously, because school is out, but we are very proud of the fact that we've had well over 800 students participating in the program this year. The student program and the lecture series would simply not be possible without the support of our sponsors. So if you would give them a hand, I would appreciate that. Critical thinking skills is the title here. Please discuss the quality of critical thinking in America and how we can increase critical thinking skills in the era of 24-hour news and blogging. Are Americans' critical thinking skills adequate? But we choose to reinforce our existing biases. Critical thinking, is it possible to get back to that in the atmosphere we're in now?
God, I hope so. No, seriously, I am afraid that we are just teetering on the edge of abject surrender to technology. The technology is not what makes journalism. I got in some trouble with my colleagues, camera people at CNN, when 30 years ago I made the observation that simply covering an event live, simply putting a camera on an event and letting the camera record that event or broadcast it live, that was not journalism. That's technology. Journalism requires sifting fact from fiction. Journalism requires editing. Journalism requires very often a team, certainly in my area and Judy's and Howard's, where you're in broadcasting, you don't do it alone. That requires critical thinking. And the notion that somehow the American public can sit back now and say, well, Google and Apple have taken care of it. We don't have to engage in critical thinking anymore. What nonsense, of course. Critical thinking is more important now because information is coming at us at far greater speed than it ever has before. That doesn't mean that we give up critical thinking. It means that we have to apply ourselves to critical thinking with far greater skill and discipline than ever before.
That's the challenge.
I would just add, and I don't mean to be overly critical of the news business. I love this business. All I ever wanted to do in life was to be a newspaper reporter. But we used to make all of these very important decisions that Ted describes. What to put in, what to leave out, who to quote, how to frame the story, which story was the lead story, whether it was on the front page, on a newscast, or in the internet era, what leads the homepage. Increasingly, in terms of critical thinking, everybody in America now gets to be their own editor. All of the raw video and what the politicians said and the reports and PDF files are now available to everybody. You can compile your own magazine online. And so, to some extent, we need to make decisions for our respective news organizations that reflect our values and good news judgment. And sometimes we make mistakes, and sometimes we are human, and sometimes bias seeps in. But really, a lot of the responsibility has shifted to all the people out there who now can make their own decisions about what they want to see. The thing I worry about is that people will seek out all the certain sites and opinions and bloggers and columnists online that match what they already think and limit their exposure to the other side.
Okay. Let me ask about the issue of security versus our freedom. And I'd like to add to that the whole issue of we're talking about new technology. Obviously, the world of cyber technology and the ability to conduct cyber attacks of one kind or another are part of this new technology that we're dealing with. What are the possibilities of you touch on this in your book, but what are the possibilities of a disastrous cyber attack on this country?
Great. Let me start off by making an observation that many of you already know. The internet was never designed to be defended. The internet was designed so that smart people, professors, could exchange good ideas at the speed of light. The book I've written focuses primarily on the power grid, which is unique in the sense that almost every other infrastructure in the country depends upon our electric power. It's unique also in the sense that the only way that electric power companies in this country can produce and move electricity and ultimately deliver electricity is that these 3,200 companies now, which again have been deregulated, they are like a balloon with 3,200 valves. If you have too much air coming in, the balloon will explode. Too much air going out, the balloon will collapse. It is the internet that keeps the perfect balance between the amount of electricity that's being generated and the amount of electricity that's being used. I'm sorry to have gone a little bit wonky on you there for a minute, but you need to understand that the Chinese and the Russians are already in our power grids. We only have 3 of them. They have the capacity to knock out electric power for tens of millions of Americans for a period of weeks or months at a time. Now, the Chinese and the Russians are unlikely to do this, but the Iranians are not far behind them. And just behind them in line are the North Koreans. And then come groups like ISIS. Will the day come that groups of hackers or terrorists have the capability of taking down one of our power grids? Yes, absolutely. Why do I burden you with all this information? Because while Donald Trump is blabbing on about building a wall between us and Mexico, or keeping Islamic immigrants out of the United States, we're way beyond that, folks. Far greater damage can be done to this country with one stroke of a key on a laptop computer from some part of the world that it will take our intelligence agencies, and we're sitting here with the former director of the CIA, so I'm very cautious about what I'm saying. Somebody out there sitting in Buenos Aires or Oslo or Johannesburg or Brooklyn could take out one of our power grids and inflict greater harm on the American public than has ever been inflicted by any war we have ever waged. Does that answer your question?
It's you scared the hell out of me.
Me too. I will say that every administration, high-ranking person you talk to in any of the security fields, whether it's defense, CIA, Homeland Security. You ask them what they're worried about the most, and they'll get to cybersecurity. It is an enormous worry that keeps them awake at
No,
night.
there's no question. It is the battlefield of the future. It's the battlefield of the present already, but it is the battlefield of the future in terms of the kind of damage that could be done.
And I should point out, in fairness, the reason I sat down and wrote the book is because I read a speech by Leon Panetta to a group of defense contractors talking about the danger of a cyber Pearl Harbor.
Let's take this to the next step, which is the whole issue of, I talked about security and our freedom and how do you balance both of these, and the issue of privacy and the issue of providing the kind of information we need if we're going to be able to go after a terrorist. How do we balance those two? Do we have to choose between our freedom and our security, or can we do both?
I think we have to do both, and we have to we'll be constantly struggling, I think, to figure out where the line is drawn. There's no one right answer right now. I mean, there are going to be instances that come along where we want to err on the side of more security, and then there'll be other cases that come along where we want to err on the side of privacy. If anybody tells you they've got all the answers for every single case, every single problem that presents itself, they're not, they're just not telling you the truth. It's, I had a conversation earlier today with someone who was talking about the difficulty the government is facing now and in the future. For example, they said if the CIA wants to put someone undercover in a country overseas, and say that person was active in social media, and then he or she joined the CIA, went dark for a few years, and then is in the diplomatic corps working in an embassy in another country. And the government of that country is smart enough to know, to follow social media and to go in and look, okay, what happened to that person's Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, YouTube, whatever. And they look and they say, there's this missing place here. These are the kinds of things that that are looking, and that's just one small example. There's so many more like that out there.
Howard, let me ask you about this right of privacy. With information now, I mean, most of these companies know our habits, they know what we're doing, they follow us, we have GPS. Does the right of privacy really mean anything these days, or is it an outdated principle?
I think Americans have already, by and large, surrendered the right of privacy, that we are complicit in this, and we have done it because of all the conveniences that we want to enjoy. I mean, you ever have experience where you go online and buy a pair of shoes, and 10 minutes later, every site you go to is serving up shoe ads, even though you're not going to buy any more shoes for another year? That's the small...
Spoken like a man.
Yeah. One a year is enough for me. It's not just GPS, it's how much Google knows about our searches, it's how much Facebook knows about our preferences, so that they can service the algorithms more efficiently. Now, there are ways, if you go through layers of menus, to opt out of this, but I think most people have decided they would rather have the convenience of booking their airline travel online and all of that. And it does worry me. I have the sense that most Americans under 30 do not worry about this at all, that they just see this as the price of living in modern society, that they kind of document everything in their lives online anyway, sometimes without thinking about something they post and how it's going to look to a future employer when they're trying to get a job. So that does worry me, and certainly the security aspects that Ted has talked about so eloquently worry me a great deal. But I think this privacy battle has been lost, and if there are tech companies in the future that want to do more than just exploit us commercially, we have provided a lot of ammunition.
And less than a year ago, I think it was in the fall of last year, Chinese intelligence vacuumed up 21.2 million personnel records. These weren't just random personnel. These were folks from the CIA, folks from the FBI, folks from the Department of Defense, folks from the Department of State. 22.1 million. It's going to take the Chinese 10 years just to sift through that bonanza of intelligence. Now, given that kind of capability among our enemies, the question of the degree to which we want to empower our own intelligence agencies to defend against that kind of thing, that's a very complicated question, more complicated than it's ever been in the past. I mean, the NSA is the most skilled agency that we have in the U.S. government. And if the only way they can defend the United States against our enemies is by penetrating some of my private information, I never thought I'd be saying this. I've been an advocate of privacy all my life, but you know, it's a question of balancing one evil against another.
Yeah. Howard, your question. How would you advise would you advise your child to enter journalism as a profession?
I have actually faced that question. And I told my oldest daughter that it is not as glamorous as it seems. It's a lot of long hours that you don't necessarily get paid a lot, at least when you set out. And she decided to do it anyway, though she's gone in a slightly different direction from my career. You know, I think about that. We were talking earlier amongst ourselves about newspapers and how we all love the feel of newspapers and grew up reading newspapers, and yet, you know, there aren't many people under 30 who care about having the print edition delivered to their doorstep because they feel like they can get everything online, they can get it through Google, they can get it through Facebook and all of that. So on the one hand, it would be hard for me to, as much as I sort of have ink in my veins, to say, well, gee, being a newspaper reporter, that'd be a great career because obviously the industry is shrinking. About 1/3 of all newsroom jobs have vanished over the last, I don't know, 8 to 10 years with a real impact, I think, on the kind of watchdog journalism at the local level, especially where there's no substitute for it. And your local papers here, who's keeping an eye on City Hall and the budgets and the hospitals and the schools and all of that. At the same time, lots of new digital age jobs are being generated, and I do think there is a lot of growth there. So I guess the short answer is I would sound a lot of cautionary notes to whether it's my kids or anybody else's kids about whether that's the future they want. But I think there's a new journalism that is in the process of being created. We're in this transition period now. It's probably comparable to the early days of cable, where we don't know exactly what's going to emerge from all this, news on your phone and all of that. Will newspapers survive in anything like their current form? But at the same time, it's kind of an exciting time if you are digitally minded to be in the news and information business.
Has social media contributed to the splintering of the two dominant political parties? And I would just add to that. Do you think that social media has contributed to the gridlock that we're seeing in Washington, the divisions that are so prevalent these days? Judy?
I think it has, but I don't subscribe to the view that it's mainly responsible for the gridlock. I think it's been coming probably since the 90s. After Bill Clinton was elected. I pretty much date it back to the election of Bill Clinton when you had his presidency began and you had Newt Gingrich as Speaker of the House and the contract with America, and you began to see the bifurcating. I mean, there's already a strong disagreement between the parties and raging debates that go back through the history of our country. But there was something that became more personal and more visceral, I think, at that point. And there was almost, I think, a resentment on the part of Republicans, many Republicans, that Bill Clinton was elected. And then in 2000, you had the resentment of Democrats that Republicans took over the White House, and then it got worse, and then it even more so with Obama for all the reasons that we know. So you've had that, on top of which the redistricting that we've had. I know you've talked about that in your lecture series. We've watched the gerrymandering of congressional districts, which contributed to the polarization and gridlock in Washington. Money in politics, another subject I know you've tackled here, that has contributed, I think, greatly. And you put it all into a pot and stir it around, and you throw in cable news and social media and just the technology of today. and we can all go off in our different directions. And as I think I said earlier, we're now not even listening to the other side. We just listen to those people who tell us what we already believe. And social media basically allows us to reinforce that. And I think that's really worrying. I don't subscribe to the idea that somebody's going to come in with a magic wand and say, aha, now we're all united. But I don't see how you begin to bring people together.
Ted, let me ask you, because I've said one of the principal responsibilities of the next president, there are really two responsibilities. One is to break the gridlock in Washington and to govern, because I can't imagine spending another 4 years of paralysis and what that would do to the country. And the other is to provide world leadership. But going to the gridlock question, how does the president break that gridlock?
Well, let me, first of all, this has been a bit of a downer of an evening, so let me let me offer a
We've just blown everybody up with the cyber attack.
well, that's right. I was pointing at myself more than anyone else, but Winston Churchill many years ago made the observation that the Americans always end up doing the right thing, but only after they've exhausted every other possibility. We are in the process of exhausting every other possibility. But in answer to your question, Leon, I am hopeful that our president, he or she, will undertake some leadership in this regard. And leadership means not spending your whole life worrying about which medium of communication you're going to use to reach the right people. Leadership means actually doing something, taking some risks, investing whatever capital Mrs. Clinton has, or Donald Trump has, or whoever becomes president, whatever capital they have in those first few months, for God's sake, spend it. I think Americans are beginning to catch on to the notion, and if they aren't, just take a look at what's going on in Great Britain, that we are on the edge of an abyss, that things have gotten very, very bad, that this idea of stovepiping information, of just, as Howie mentioned before, sitting in these little cocoons where we bathe ourselves in echoes of our own prejudices, listening to talk radio or going on whatever social medium it happens to be. I think we will respond to genuine leadership, no matter which medium of communication it reaches us through. But we need leadership. It's been a long time since we've had it. And we need, as a people, to refresh our memories of what America is really about. And I mean, we are not a people that rose to greatness through all these petty animosities that mark our society today. And it is time to remind ourselves that Congress, and here is a man who, throughout his long and distinguished career, has always reached across the aisle. Hell, you've even walked across the aisle, right? People used to respond to that, and I'm confident, Leon, that they will again.
Howard, what can you say? It was one of my greatest joys in public life was the ability to work across the aisle to get things done. It's no fun to be in Washington if you're just pounding your shoe on the table. The responsibility is to get something done. That's why you elect people to go back there. Twitter is a niche.
Or niche.
So, a niche social media tool, and yet candidate tweets make more news today than almost any other media. Why?
Because they're faster. You talked about the Clinton era when the polarization perhaps became worse in Washington, and that was a time when the rapid response unit consisted of sending faxes. They are faster. It's because every journalist I know, I should say most journalists, are on Twitter and are monitoring what they say. And it is because Ted Koppel had a great point when he talked about the illusion of intimacy. You know, a lot of these tweets are written by 22-year-old staff members. Sometimes they get into trouble and they say, oh, the candidate never saw that. It was just this kid who no longer works here. So Twitter probably does have an outsized influence. I mean, as a company that's struggling financially, it doesn't have the huge audience that Facebook does, but it does drive a lot of news and politics because it is so easy for anybody with a public platform to amass a following, whether you are Donald Trump or whether you are Justin Bieber or whether you are an anchor with a television show. And it seems to personalize things. But mostly I think it is the amplification effect. Twitter by itself would have some influence. I can't tell you how many times, because I keep different TVs on different cable networks because part of my job is to know what's going on, where suddenly, you know, Elizabeth Warren has tweeted this back at Donald Trump, and it's easy and it's quick and it's usually kind of like the equivalent of today's 21st century equivalent of a soundbite. So I think those are among the reasons why it now seems to be on the cutting edge, but by next year, it'll be something else.
You think it'll move?
No, I just think that, you know, we keep joking about Snapchat, but for a lot of people who are 18 or 22 or 27, they now think Facebook is kind of old hat, and they are migrating to places like Snapchat, to places like Instagram. And I think Snapchat, there's actually a Business Week article saying it was deliberately designed to appeal to young people by making it too complicated for old folks to figure out how the hell to use. And that made me feel better.
But, you know, Howard, tell people what Snapchat, you know, I'm sure this is a very distinguished and well-educated audience, but tell them what Snapchat does. It's an extraordinary piece of equipment.
Well, it began as a way for people, mostly young people, to send to each other messages that within 60 seconds would disappear. Now, use your imagination, if you were a teenager, how that might come in handy. That was the original use of Snapchat, but it has grown. Messaging services are really hot as opposed to just like going to a website. And so it has grown into news organizations now partner with Snapchat, including the New York Times and CNN, I believe. You can follow the news. It uses a lot of images and photos. A lot of the stuff is very transitory. It is even, you know, in my view, more simplified than Twitter. At the same time, it's all about building an audience, and it's all about what is seen as cool. And right now it is seen as very cool, to the point that major media organizations are taking it very seriously, even though some of us have trouble pronouncing it.
But think about what that says about us. That one of the most popular forms of communication now involves communicating either words or an image that will disappear in a matter of seconds. There was a time when we actually thought the whole point of communication was to say something worth remembering. Now we're communicating images and words that are designed to disappear. What does that say about us?
Judy, let me ask you.
I'm going to check it out.
Talk about disappearing. Judy, let me ask you, Ted commented that the NewsHour does a great job at really kind of doing in-depth presentation of news stories. And it kind of represents what I would call kind of mainstream presentation of the news. And yet, when you go online, it's all about headlines and hits, et cetera, et cetera. Give me your sense of where we're headed. Do you feel that what you're doing in the NewsHour is something that will continue to be there in the future, or is it going to be subsumed by these online tweets that are taking place?
Well, this is self-serving to say this, but I mean, Jim Lehrer and Robin McNeil went on the air in 1975 with the McNeil-Lehrer Report. The show is, Robin retired in 1995, Jim retired in 2011. The show is going stronger than ever. The ratings are up. We have more what we call underwriters, sponsors, backers of the program, because it's public television, we don't sell advertising. So our audience is responding, and I will just anecdotally, I'll tell you, that when we run into people who write in and they tweet to us or email us, or they say, please don't stop doing what you're doing because we don't see anything else like this out there. I'm having a hard time saying this without sounding like I'm just patting me on the back, and I don't want to do that, but I do think the kind of program we do is different enough from what's available in other places that it will continue to have a place in the news media spectrum in this country. The reason, and thank you, Gwen and I often say what we do is this is not about us, it's about making sure this program stays strong so that the next anchor and the next anchor and the next team after team after team can carry it on into the future as far as possible.
You look at this stuff seriously. I mean, if you had to look at the next 5 to 10 years, what do you see happening with media and technology? I mean, you know, if we go ahead 10 years into the future, are newspapers fading out? You know, are shows like this going to fade out? Are we all going to be online with our Apple? I mean, what do you see happening?
If I knew the answer to that, I would know which stocks to buy. And I'll answer your question in a moment, Leon, but just for the record, I went to Snapchat on the Discover tab. I see People magazine, ESPN, Comedy Central, BuzzFeed, CNN, Mashable, and Cosmopolitan, and Vice. So it's a real eclectic connection of organizations. Everybody in my business is trying to figure that out as a matter of survival. So, for example, are newspapers going to become a niche product because as the population ages, people who feel the need to have something dropped in their doorstep will diminish? Will they move completely online? I think online will be the dominant form of news delivery. Everybody in the television business knows that the audience is getting older, that a lot of people are cutting the cord, that they don't feel the need to have a cable news subscription that is bundled, so you're paying for the sports channels whether you watch them or not, even if you only want to watch MSNBC or Fox or the local channels or PBS, which is indispensable. So I feel that a lot of the trends that are moving us toward more individualized news, of people coming up with their own menu. There's an application that I call Flipboard, where you can basically design your own magazine. It can include your Twitter feed, but it can also include any number of organizations you like, whether you are interested in tennis, or whether you're interested in politics, or whether you're interested in lots of subjects in between. The question I have is, will any of these new forms be able to generate enough revenue, because digital ads don't pay that much right now, we're all kind of hanging on in that space, to support newsrooms that, as in the heyday of the networks and the newspapers before they lost a lot of their staff, were able to do investigative reporting, enterprise reporting, holding politicians accountable, as well as cover the local sports teams and the local schools and all of that. And that is an open question, and I tend to be optimistic. I think there's a lot of smart people coming up in the ranks who will figure this out, but my great fear is that if people just go for what is easy and quick and disappearing messages, that those newsrooms will hollow out and we will lose something that will be very hard to get back, and that is the journalistic muscle to do what news organizations have always done.
What do you think?
May I do a quick poll here? How many of you here have seen or heard of a program called Last Week Tonight with John Oliver? Oh, good. That's not bad. I'd say that's about a third. It is an absolutely brilliant program. John Oliver is a British comedian, Speed up?
Yes.
Oh,
Because we're down to 1 minute.
it's a damn good program. Watch it.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of the program, and it's been, as always, a great and fascinating discussion with, particularly with the quality of speakers that we've had here. But I do really want all of you to focus on this issue of the kind of technology and media that we're dealing with, because I truly believe that whoever is elected the next president of the United States, that in many ways the success or failure of that president will really be determined by how effectively that person is able to communicate with the American people and to unify this country rather than dividing it. That hopefully will be our future and the future that our children need in order to have a better life. Thank you very much for attending, and good night.